do that. So welcome, everybody, all of you. My name is Eric Kingston. I'm with Idaho Housing and Finance Association. I'm their Housing Resources Coordinator and work on a lot of their fair housing outreach issues. We got kind of a targeted session today with David Penny, who spent a lot of his career with Kosho Humphreys representing housing providers in civil rights cases and also doing training for realtors. So now he's with Tomlinson Associates, and we're really lucky to have him join us today. And let's see, we've got Christina Carlos with IHFA's Marketing Communications Department, and I want to thank her for all of her help with registration and certifications and stuff like that. So without further ado, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and get that set up so that we can get David in there. Let's see, there we go. And so today, again, if you're a realtor or a real estate professional, you are in the right place. And we're going to go ahead and get started on this. First of all, we're going to kind of put David right over here in the corner so everybody can see him during the recording. And this is our acknowledgement and disclaimer. The work that we've been doing on our outreach this last almost a year is funded through a grant from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And this is the disclaimer that says everything you're about to hear is all David and no HUD. But they've seen this and reviewed the material, and they know he's a good guy. So we're going to go ahead and get started.
Okay, good morning, everybody. We do have an intimate group because I think our topic here is a much more targeted and smaller scale. And before we get started, I will also tell you the Idaho Real Estate Commission has a video that I helped them make, kind of an interview process with certain questions about the Fair Housing Act and how realtors can comply with anti-discrimination laws. So you might be able to find that as well. But the certainly objective this morning isn't to teach everybody about the Fair Housing Act so that you're an expert in what the law text is, but more along the lines of practical skills, how the real estate agent and broker can achieve compliance with the Fair Housing Act. So let's go to the next slide. The Fair Housing Act is about civil rights. It arises from the Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 68. And basically, federal housing laws is a little bit broader. Oh, go back. We jumped a slide, jumped 2 slides. Okay, so you've got federal law, which is mostly what we talk about, state law and local law. The state of Idaho laws are pretty much follow the Fair Housing Act, although the state of Idaho's anti-discrimination statute does not mention familial status as a protected class. Doesn't matter, federal law applies in the state of Idaho and does require it to be a federal or a protected class. And then you have the local laws of certain cities and municipalities, which I'll touch on in just a minute. But the protected classes, most of them are well known: race, color, religion, national origin. National origin is defined as where a person comes from or where their predecessors, their parents, grandparents, and then where their national origin very often deals with the attributes of that origin, such as language and custom. And then the next protected class listed there is sex, and I've added gender identity and sexual orientation because most recently there's been a U.S. Supreme Court case that interpreted a different area of civil rights law and in the employment setting. And in that setting, they interpreted sex to include gender identity and sexual orientation, such that the prohibitions against sex discrimination also prohibit discrimination on those bases as well. While there's not a case specific to housing law, it just makes sense that the court would view it the same way. And in fact, that's kind of the way the industry, real estate industries are going as well. And then familial status, which is the presence of someone under the age of 18 in the household, and mental or physical disability. And we're going to talk mostly about those last two, familial status and mental or physical disability, because those tend to come up the most. And there's a little more intricacy to how you can apply the law and what's required by somebody. It's a little more difficult. On the others, and we're going to get into some examples, it's a little more black and white. The other thing that go ahead and go to the next slide, Eric. Okay, why fair housing compliance is a priority. One, it's the law, and good citizens want to follow the laws. As I mentioned, federal and state are close enough that if you know the federal Fair Housing Act, comply with it, you'll be complying with the laws of the state of Idaho. As far as other laws, I do need to mention that some of the local municipalities in the state of Idaho, Boise is one of them, I think Pocatello, Idaho Falls, Haley, Ketchum, and Sandpoint, and up to Moscow and Coeur d'Alene have local ordinances that actually make it a crime, a misdemeanor for someone to discriminate against someone based upon sexual orientation or gender identity. And so if your real estate practice extends into those areas, that's just another reason to make sure that you have that expansive definition of sex and what's protected against discrimination in mind. Of course, also as a real estate person, you're there to help people in real estate transactions. That's how you make your living. Cutting down on the pool of possible clients is usually not a good business decision. I mentioned non-compliance is a denial of civil rights. It goes all the way back. There's quite a history lesson, but goes all the way back to the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s, and it's a very serious matter. Entities such as HUD at an administrative level or the U.S. Department of Justice take civil rights violations very seriously. And then non-compliance is expensive. So we'll talk about this a little bit more at the end, but if someone is to have found that they have violated the Fair Housing Act, violated civil rights laws, then there's penalties, there are damages that can be recovered, not to mention just the legal cost of having to hire counsel to defend in such a matter, and then the time away from your chosen profession. So certainly spending the time becoming educated and complying with the law is by far the better business decision. So let's go to the next slide. Before I get into this slide, I do want to mention that the National Association of Realtors has been very progressive in bringing fair housing to the forefront and making it part of the lexicon, as well as just the professionalism of real estate agents and brokers. It's Article 10 of the Realtors Code of Ethics and Standards of Practice for 2021. And there's also a declaration for realtors to state that they agree. And just without reading the whole thing, I think it's important to point out that their gender and sexual orientation and gender identity are included within that pledge. But it's basically that a real estate agent pledges to provide equal professional service without regard to the race, color, religion, gender, disability, familial status, national origin, sexual orientation, or gender identity of any prospective client, customer, or of the residents of any community. And that's a very good statement. And I think a very concise statement of what everyone needs to do. That's a good pronouncement of the law and what's required. But it goes on to say that you'll keep informed about fair housing laws and practices, that you'll develop advertising that indicates that everyone is welcome and no one is excluded. And then I think this is real important. It says, inform my clients and customers about their rights and responsibilities under the fair housing law. Document my efforts to provide professional services. And then I think most important and most concise, refuse to tolerate non-compliance. And there's more there. You can certainly find that online, but it dovetails with the definition of fair housing that we've just gone through, and again highlights the importance of why we study fair housing law. So there are limitations on the reach of the fair housing laws, and it's important to know that fair housing doesn't apply to a private individual so long as they do not own more than 3 single-family homes. The transaction they're involved in does not involve a real estate agent. Their advertising or notices are not discriminatory, and they have not engaged in real estate sales within the 24 months preceding, and the owner is not in the business of selling or renting dwellings. So really the exception is the person who's just selling their home on their own. Regardless of the number of homes they own, regardless of any of the other facts, once a real estate agent or broker is involved, the Fair Housing Act applies in all respects. And then also the other thing to glean from this slide is that the private individual selling their home still cannot send advertising or notices that are discriminatory. The anti-discrimination in advertising and housing applies to everybody in all circumstances. So let's go to the next slide. So here again, talking about limitations, we're going to get into disability. Customers or individuals with clients with disabilities and requests for accommodation, which is a change in the law or a change in a policy or procedure or service that's provided to allow the person with the disability to participate. But that process of accommodation does not apply to an owner who occupies a building that has 4 or fewer dwelling units. So a fourplex that's owner occupied in one of the units is not required to, and that's the extent of ownership of real estate. then the accommodation process does not apply. Fair housing laws are not the Americans with Disabilities Act. Basically, the way to think of it is Americans with Disabilities Act applies to places of public accommodation. It would apply to clubhouses at an apartment complex. It would apply to the leasing office at an apartment complex, but it stops at the threshold of the apartment or a house. Inside that house is governed by the Fair Housing Act. Americans with Disabilities Act is a narrower area of the law, certainly in the area of animals and assistance animals, in that the Americans with Disability Act only acquires or will only recognize an actual service animal as an accommodation, an animal that's been trained to perform some certain act or function that ameliorates the disability, whereas the fair housing laws are much broader and recognize an additional class of animals, comfort animals, that do not have to be trained or serve a specific function, but can be to help ameliorate a disability. And they're very often disabilities that deal with things such as depression, PTSD, and those type of things. And those type of animals have to be accommodated under fair housing laws. And then the other main point of this slide is the Fair Housing Act. It applies to individuals and to corporations. It applies to the real estate agent, the broker, the brokerage. And so very often, if you see an enforcement action, it doesn't just stop with the individual. If that individual is part of a real estate agency, you could have the agency, the owner of the agency, a number of people who are responsible for the actions of that agent. So let's go to the next slide. So what is the discriminatory conduct under the fair housing laws? The first example, refusing to rent, sell, or finance, basically a denial of housing. And I'll take the second one here and kind of give some examples together. The other one's refusing to give information, discouraging from renting or purchasing, or lying about availability. And these are the ones that have, often come up with those that are the religion, race, national origin, that are a little more black and white, as far as whether there's a violation or not, and what's required as far as compliance. But an example of this type, maybe you have a client who has listed a property with you for you to show. And in the course of listing that with you, or right before they're willing to sign the listing agreement, they look at you and say, now, this neighborhood's full of my very good friends, and the last thing they want is a family from Africa moving in here. Or a family with, it could be familial status discrimination. They really don't want children. Don't want somebody with teenagers who might be loud or race up and down the streets or do all those things teenagers do. And you'll make sure that that doesn't happen, right? Puts the agent in a very tough spot. Of course, we just looked at the duties and the declaration that it would be to educate that individual that for you to agree to do that, or for you to refuse to show a property or give information to a family or someone from Africa, or someone with teenagers, then you would be violating the Fair Housing Act, and therefore you could not do that. And so hopefully you could educate that individual. Then the next, applying different rules, privileges, standards, or qualifications. And this is one where still it could be the same type of circumstance, but it's perhaps not as overt. It's a little more implicit, and just that makes it harder for somebody instead of an out and out denial, just making it harder for somebody to succeed in purchasing a property. This often has to do with things such as lending, the standards or qualifications. There have been a lot of lawsuits against lenders based upon, and banks, some well-known ones like Wells Fargo, spinning off from lending practices and discrimination in lending practices based upon race or predominantly minority neighborhoods using a zip code. So the next number, variation in eviction, providing of services. The eviction, of course, that has to do with usually the rental of a property, but having a standard where you're much quicker to evict or proceed with evicting against minorities or against a protected class would be discrimination. And then also the providing of services, willing to show properties to a man and woman as a couple who are married, but unwilling to provide that service to two people whose gender identity may not be as conventional. Making discriminatory statements. This is a big area. Here again, I think the real estate industry has responded well to this, but the bottom line is that when you're advertising for real estate, you advertise the attributes of the property, not who you're looking for. But statements that that are against families, statements of a preference of gender or of race, all of these would be inappropriate. Statements, very often those with regard to families, are very subtle in that it will just be to the extent that it's a very quiet property or neighborhood. If that's pushed too far, that could indicate that you're expressing a preference against families. Let's go to the next slide. Steering is one of the areas that often come up, and that is very often it's unintentional, sometimes intentional, but a person comes and you evaluate their information and they want to look at properties, and you then make, as the agent, make some assumptions about what they might like based upon their national origin or the color of their skin or their religion. You find out that the person is Catholic, and you think that, they're going to want to be in that nice, quiet Catholic neighborhood. So I'll show them properties there as opposed to any place else. Then that would be steering, making assumptions that people of a certain national origin or race want to be together. And so making their, steering or directing their real estate acquisition experience to that area would be illegal steering. And so, here again, it's to think expansively and to think about attributes of property and not the attributes of the client. Harassing, intimidating, threatening, or coercing. Of course, this would be extremely blatant. I think it'd be hard to find these with regard to a real estate agent or professional engaging in that type of conduct, but you could have a client who's that way. You could be having an open house, and I know usually the client isn't there for the opening house, but maybe they're there for part of it, and they recoil and have a harsh reaction to a family of a particular race coming to look at their house in their neighborhood. Refusing to let a person with a disability make modifications necessary to use the dwelling. We're going to get into this a little bit more, but in addition, accommodation of a person with a disability is a change in a policy, procedure, rule, or a service that lets the person with the disability, basically you're tearing down that barrier of the disability so they have an equal opportunity to the full gambit of opportunity to be in a real estate transaction. Modifications have to do with a change in a physical structure, ramps, rails, those type of things are modifications. And the way it would come up in the real estate setting would be allowing the person with the disability who's interested in the house, for example, to have their professional come look at the house about making, they buy the house, that they might make modifications that would make it more accessible or easier for the person with the disability to use. And perhaps your client recoils at that and just doesn't like the idea. They're umbilically connected to this residence, although they're selling it, and just tell you, no, I'm not going to consider them buying the house because they want to make modifications. That, of course, would be wrong. Then the last bullet point here, refusing to make changes. I talked about that a little bit. That, of course, is the scope of a reasonable accommodation. So let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to bear down now a little bit into the area of disability, which most people will tell you is the predominant area where there are complaints. And by complaints, I mean the person believes they've been discriminated against, and so they contact HUD or go to HUD's website and fill out a fair housing complaint. And then HUD is required by law to intake that complaint and then investigate it, which means they would send the complaint, if it's against you or your agency, send you the complaint and give you an opportunity to respond. And then you should probably start thinking about having an attorney help you through the process. A complaint can also be, without going through the administrative process with HUD, can be a legal complaint in a lawsuit filed within 2 years after the incident. But anyway, the types of complaints with regard to disability. What does disability mean? It means a person with a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more of the person's major life activities. The law and medicine have developed that there are, of course, some very recognized disabilities that are both mental and physical. Physical are usually easier and often obvious. A person whose sensory sensories are impaired: sight, hearing, speech. Those are all, if impaired, those would be disabilities. Mobility disabilities are a big one. Inability to stand long periods of time, walk, the need or use of a wheelchair or some type of assistance device. And then mental impairments, one of the more common are post-traumatic stress disorder, but it can be bipolar disorder, it can be alcoholism, it can be a prior addiction to an illegal substance, so long as the person's not continuing to use it. So there's quite a list of things that impair someone's major life activities. Chances are you're not going to have to ferret these types of things out. Either the disability will be obvious or the person will tell you. Individuals who are real estate agent and brokers are in a little different setting than, say, the housing provider, in that housing provider will have a set of forms, hopefully, and a process for someone to make a request, to send a document to that person's care provider or someone else who's qualified to verify the disability and the need for the accommodation, and get that piece of paper back and then make the accommodation. Maybe it's to allow a comfort animal, maybe it's to install grab bars in a bathroom, or something along those lines, to take up carpet, replace it with vinyl. Could be some of those. But in the real estate transaction setting, you could go through that process. That process is certainly available to you, but it usually is less formal, and one of those where verification, your relationship isn't going to be as long as potentially a landlord tenant. So you probably find yourself in a situation where you're going to accept either an observation by you or a statement by the person that they have a disability and they therefore need help. Go to the next slide. And here again, I think we've touched on this, the laws that apply. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, so here back to disability. The agent's responsibility does not arise until the client discloses they have a disability or the disability is apparent. You're not a medical professional. You could observe somebody, for example, with a cane or with a seeing eye dog, or in a wheelchair or other type of mobility assistance. Those would be obvious. In that situation, it doesn't require verification that the person has a disability. If it's not apparent, then here again, you can't and aren't required to go out and try and diagnose people every time you meet a client or potential client. They have to usually tell you that they have a disability, or by telling you of a need that they have, it would be clear that they have a disability. So it's also not up to you nor proper for you to ask somebody who has if they have a disability, or to inquire into the type, nature, or extent of their disability or limitations. It's more directed towards them expressing a need that is based upon a disability. They don't have to tell you what their disability is, but it could be that you're in showing them properties. They need for you to make the appointment after 12 o'clock in the afternoon. And then they might just tell you something that, physically or mentally, I just need those appointments at that time of day. I can't see properties in the morning. Might be that type of an expression, or that they ask that you drive them because they're not capable when you show them properties. So then the agent's goal is to overcome barriers that are disability related. Things you can say. You can, if in doubt, ask somebody, how may I help you? Or you can ask, do you have any special needs? Here again, focused on the need that I can help you with. So you could be planning to go show somebody properties and you're unclear, or maybe you had just ask everybody, do you have any special needs that I can help you with? And that at least gives the person the chance to say, well, yes, we will, if we're going to go together, I need my accessible van or car to ride in. So that's an example. And then the second part is be vigilant for a request for accommodation, in that a request can be verbal. It does not have to be in writing, and you can't require that it be in writing. And certainly for the real estate agent, it's almost certainly to come in conversation. But all this fits because your goal is to help somebody so that they are engaged in a real estate transaction, and that's your livelihood. Let's go to the next slide. So then, what by definition, accommodation is a request for a change in rules, policies, practices, or services that may be necessary to afford a disabled person equal opportunities. I think we've covered this. The request can be verbal or in writing. If your policy or practice that you have is to verify that a person has a disability and needs an accommodation, you can require that the verification be in writing from somebody who knows, but the request can be verbal. And then a modification is a change to a dwelling so that a person with a disability has an equal opportunity to use it and enjoy it. Typically, you're not going to get that type of request from someone that you're just showing properties to. The big point there is just that, in working with someone that you're showing properties or in properties that you've listed for sale, that you have to be acceptable to someone who, with a disability, wants to explore the concept of modifying the property. It says here, generally requests must be honored so long as the individual has a disability and establishes there is a connection between the request and the individual's ability to participate in a real estate transaction. Go to the next slide. I think I've got the exception. I think we've covered most of these. Jump down to the third bullet point there. The real estate professional should grant the request unless doing so would create an undue financial or administrative burden, or granting the request would fundamentally alter the nature of the professional's business. And we're going to go through some examples here, but just, to hit on it, it would be a reasonable request that should be granted if the person you were showing properties to said, well, in addition to me, I need to bring Mr. Jones. He's my care provider, and I need him to come with us. That would be a reasonable thing. I mean, every real estate agent should say yes to that. But the person comes and says, well, I can't do this on my own, so I need you to find me a care provider who can accompany me while you show me properties. Well, financial burden, administrative burden for you to go do this, And then it would fundamentally alter what a real estate agent does. That's not what you do. That's not your business, finding care providers for persons with disabilities. So that's just kind of a stark example of what, and we're going to get into some more. And then the other thing is, and then this fits with also real estate agents and wanting to help with people in transactions, is that if you can't grant a request that is made by a person with a disability, see if there's an alternative to the accommodation that they want you to provide that would be more reasonable and not a financial administrative burden or change what you do. This might seem like a silly example, but let's say you're having an open house and somebody comes there who's mobility challenged. There's an upstairs to the property, and they want you to take hold of their wheelchair and pull them up the stairs so that they can view the second floor. Well, I would tell you that that is not a reasonable request. Here again, that would be an alteration of what you do as a professional. Also, it puts you at risk of injury due to what's involved in pulling a wheelchair up the stairs. But is there an alternative? Sure there is. You could take your own cell phone, or you could take the cell phone from the person you're showing the property to, and you could go up there and take a video of the upstairs using the phone, and then bring it down to the person so that they could take a look at it. And would that impose upon you? Maybe a little bit. Maybe you've got other people there for the open house looking that you want to make sure that you're showing attention to. But going up and doing this on behalf of the person with the disability would be a reasonable alternative. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so here we're getting into some examples of a reasonable request for accommodation. Scheduling appointments for a specific time of day might be less convenient, or it might require picking up and dropping off a person that you would show property to more frequently, but it's reasonable. Flexibility in determining meeting locations. Here again, just being willing to work with somebody is important. And it might be, modes of transportation, being willing to ride in the person's van with them to show the properties. Or maybe you like to take people in your car, but for whatever reason, it might be more important to meet the person at each property separately as opposed to riding together. Attendance of care providers, a reasonable request. Use of the client's disability adapted transportation, allowing them to bring a service or comfort animal. Again, we're talking about the Fair Housing Act, so it's not just a dog trained to a particular service, but it could be to allow them to bring a comfort animal that they need because of the disability that they have. Might be a basis there. Normally you'd say, no, I just can't have an animal in my car because of danter or hair. Maybe you're allergic to animal danter. And so that creates a real problem. So what do? You arrange to meet the person there at the houses you're going to show them, work with them for them to get there separate and apart from you driving them in your car. Here again, creating a video record of parts of the house. We've discussed that. allowing clients, contractors to inspect the house for possible modifications. It might mean a special visit by you to the house because the client's contractor needs to be let in to take measurements and obtain information about possible modifications. Maybe to put in a ramp, maybe to put in one of those stairway type elevators or escalating chairs. But making an effort so that that does not become a barrier. Magnification of small print documents. This is, we all know how lawyers are, and documents have gotten longer, more complex, and that doggone fine print. So one thing that can be done with our modern technology and copiers is to enlarge print and make hard copies. It can also be basically a magnifier, or to allow them to use a magnifier, or making those available online where the magnifier online can be used to view the documents. And then allowing a client to use a wheelchair, scooter, or golf cart to view a property. Again, a reasonable request, but here again, it doesn't mean that you have to push the wheelchair or pick up the scooter or take it in and out of their car for them. You can do those things, but you're not required to be a care provider yourself. Go to the next slide. Okay, unreasonable requests. Physically carrying the client to overcome stairs or barriers, carrying them over landscaping, up stairs, for example. Those would be unreasonable requests. That's not, being a care provider is not what you do, and you are not required to do anything that would place you physically at risk. Providing the client with a care provider, that's their responsibility. But you need to be willing to allow that care provider to do their part. Driving through landscaping to improve accessibility. You're not required to do anything that impairs a property or damages property. A request that places the real estate professional at physical risk. The pushing a wheelchair, lifting an individual, those type of things you're not required to do. That places somebody else's property at risk of damage. Here again, not required to do that. If something can be done to help someone in a real estate transaction that involves some modification, maybe take a door off a hinge, if the owner of the property is willing to, or slipping a gate off a hinge, or rolling up a carpet, or providing a chair, like a folding chair, with the person as they go through the house, because they need to rest their legs every 10 or 15 minutes. Those would all be reasonable requests, but you don't have to damage the property or make a change to it that can't be put back the way it was. And then finally, a request that would require you to incur a substantial expense. And then again, I think you don't have to go rent a special car for a client because of their disability. You don't have to go rent a wheelchair, rent a scooter. You don't have to find them a dog or care for their dog or comfort animal that they need to bring along, or provide their care provider. You don't have to go buy them a computer for them to view videos or to view documents. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so now we're going to kind of shift gears and go to familial status because here again, this comes up frequently. Familial status means having a child under the age of 18 in the household. And so it can be just one child, 17 and a half, and that household is protected against familial status discrimination. And it doesn't matter whether they live with a parent, a legal guardian, or some other designee. Covers a woman who is pregnant and people in the process of adopting or gaining custody of a child. So it doesn't have to be a straight parent-child relationship. It can be grandparents who have custody or adopting grandchildren, for example. So let's go to the next slide. What actions are prohibited? No one may deny housing, limit access to housing, discourage home seekers, or create different rules, fees, or standards because of the familial status of the household. And this includes rentals, purchases, lending, advertising, and any other transaction in the housing industry. And usually the way it comes up is there assumptions about families with children. Children are hard on a property. Children are loud. Children are destructive. The family's only going to be compatible with other families. You can't make those the basis for housing industry or transaction decisions. Everybody, you can have rules that require people to behave appropriately. And by people, I mean everybody. You can't tailor those to children. But, and children in a household have to comply with reasonable rules that are applicable to everybody. But you can't go on the assumptions that children should be treated, or families with children should be treated differently. Go to the next slide. And then just some real world examples here at the end. And we've kind of touched on these. A customer tells their listing agent, our neighbors like the neighborhood the way it is and have asked that we not sell to a family with teenagers, Hispanics, or Jews. We trust you will help us with that request. And then it becomes, how would you respond to that? Well, first would be to help educate that client that neither you nor any other agent can agree to follow that type of directive. One, it would be against the law. Two, it would be a violation of the code of ethics applicable to realtors and the declaration that you've probably given not to be discriminatory in providing real estate services. Hopefully you could get the person to understand that. And I think it's key to let them know that they cannot find an agent who can agree to that and do their job. And then finally, though, if you couldn't move the person off of that, would be to decline to help them. Basically, cut them loose, because you don't want to be connected to somebody who requires that type of a prohibition that's that discriminatory in your work. Because just if you think it won't come back to bite you, it will. So let's go to the next slide. Another real world example. An immigrant family from Somalia hires you, and you learn that 3 other families from Africa recently purchased homes in the same neighborhood where there is another home for sale. Do you let that information influence the location of homes you show this client? So, if the other home for sale is legitimately within their criteria of bedrooms, bathrooms, schools, the attributes that they are looking for, there is nothing wrong with showing them that home. If you took out the part that they were Somalia and other African families, that showing of that home standing alone would be a legitimate property to show them. It's perfectly fine to do that. You should also show them other homes and a variety of other neighborhoods. So where there's, no basis at all for that, you're placing them close to other immigrant families, for example, so that they have the full spectrum and full opportunity to live wherever they want without you doing any type of steering or direct them to a particular area. So let's go to the next slide. Your client refuses to consider the best offer from a couple that is gay because he cannot stand the thought of gay people in the home that he is selling. What do you tell this client? Well, it's very similar to the first real world example that we talked about, and that helping educate them, explain your limitations, your code of ethics, that all realtors are supposed to adhere to, and hopefully help them see that the most important part of the real estate transaction is a satisfactory financial outcome for them, and that should be their focus and not on who they are selling to. But it's amazing how even someone selling a house has a strong mental connection to that particular property and will let that steer their decision making. That might be the last of the slides. Oh, additional resources. This is where Eric rejoins us.
Okay, I'm going to put in a plug here for some of the materials that we've produced through this grant, and these are items that you can request or you can watch and share. We've got some bilingual videos. We've got handouts, posters, bookmarks, these little Z cards that are kind of like a roadmap, folded thing. We've got information on YouTube. We've got a Twitter feed, and we've got a Facebook page and things like that. So we encourage you to check that out. We'll try and put up information that's relevant to you, and you can always reach out to us too. I think I'll make sure and put my contact information in the chat. I believe you might have Christina's. We'll put both of those in the chat here for you. And then David, I just wanted to touch on some of the things. You did a great job of talking about clients that may have a disability, and how people maybe that aren't familiar with those disabilities might approach that. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing for a little bit, and then this will be posted on our Fair Housing Forum page, and we'll kind of guide you to that too. Okay, so couple things. David's sort of approach on this is always ask first, before you offer, before you try to help somebody. I have lots of friends that I've worked with over the years. Some use wheelchairs to navigate. Some are blind or low vision. Some are deaf or hard of hearing. And what I've learned from them is, like someone who's blind, for instance, or low vision, the last thing they want is somebody coming at them from out of the blue and touching them or grabbing their arm or something like that. It's perfectly fine to say, what David recommended. Is there anything I can do to help, or how can I best help you? And they might say, well, just let me know if I'm going to walk off a cliff or something, then you can do that. Or if I'm going to walk into a hard object. So same with somebody in a wheelchair. The last thing they want is somebody to grab the wheelchair and start moving them around. They will ask for that help if they need it. And I think David's point of, resisting, the the urge or the request to help move somebody up or downstairs, that's a risky business for everybody involved. So I think his advice is really really good on that. The other thing is to consider market share. I mean, I'd say 11 or 12% of the people in Idaho have some form of a disability, and that's a significant market share, as we have people coming back from military service or people who might have been injured in an accident involving sports or just living, car accidents or whatever. I had a friend that wound up in a wheelchair basically from just gardening in her backyard and stepping off of a ledge. It happens, and those are people that they're clients, they're potential clients for you guys. And one of the challenges we have in the market right now is a very small number of houses, single family houses or townhouses that are either accessible or what we call visitable, which is a term that is sort of has minimal accessible features. It just means, a zero-step entrance and an accessible route through the main floor, to a bathroom that they can get in and out of. And that's a rare thing to find these days, but it's really in high demand. I have a couple friends that bought in a subdivision out in Barber Valley. They couldn't find any homes that were zero-step. And in one case, it cost this woman approximately $50,000 to retrofit the home and make it accessible. So it's a challenge, but there's really a demand for that. And anything you can find that has those accessible features, I think certainly something that's a valid thing to put in a listing to say, zero-step entry, accessible route, wheelchair accessible route, lever handles or lever hardware on the doors. Those are attributes that are really key marketing points for something. And then if you do have clients that are blind or low vision, somebody that uses a guide dog, for instance, always remember that whether they're a client or you just run into somebody, those dogs are working. And so always ask, if you're tempted to go up and pet the dog, always ask the person first. And then in your identity materials or advertising, if you want to be thoughtful about, folks that are blind or low vision, for instance, make sure that you've got good contrast. And like David said, larger print is great if you've got somebody that is maybe low vision. And then your web materials, make sure that those web materials have good contrast and that you aren't relying solely on visual information like pictures or videos that don't have a description, because those descriptions are super appreciated and they're available via screen readers for folks that are blind or low vision. Let's see, I'm trying to think of that. And, keep in mind, we've got a pretty big population of folks that are looking for homes that might have accessible features, either for themselves as they want to age in place, or for a relative or a friend or colleagues. It's something to really consider. And when you find something like that, make sure and take advantage of those attributes in your marketing. And I just want to open it up. I mean, we've got a few minutes left. We got a handful of people. This is a great group. Yeah, David, anything else?
One of the things I'd mentioned is that fair housing enforcement is often handed by HUD to fair housing advocacy groups. And one of the legitimate and often used way for them to find out if a company or a person is complying with the Fair Housing Act is through contact with a tester. And here again, this is legitimate, it's been recognized, but just as it's a recognized method for testing, it's also recognized that you should be aware that I'm not heard of testing real estate agents, but it doesn't mean it can't occur. So when you get a call, for example, a phone call, if someone is looking to have you represent them in your professional capacity, and that person tells you you are a person with a disability, or they're a person with a disability, then your antenna should go up. You should, for a couple of reasons. One, you don't want to be the subject of a complaint from a fair housing advocacy group or from a client who is learned in such things. But two, you want to comply with the law. So the second that somebody mentions that, your antenna should go up, and you should be thinking, if somebody tells you they have a disability, then you should be thinking that they're going to request that you help them in some way, and be willing to work with them, evaluate what they're asking for, get guidance if it's tough, if it's not clear what you should, how you should respond. And if it's not something that you have to do, be thinking about whether there's an alternative that you could offer them that would allow you to still help them going forward. But certainly the phone call, if you got a phone call and somebody tells you they have a disability and need your help, don't hang up. There are people out there who their first response would be, well, God, I'm too busy for this, and I'm not taking new clients or something like that. Don't make that your response. Your response is, you're in that business. If they call upon you and tell you that, there's not a way to back out or avoid it. It's part of your job. It's part of your ethics as a real estate professional.
Absolutely. And I think it's, the testing will not be limited to, a disability issue. It could be, somebody who, sounds like white, the predominant race or ethnicity in the area, and then you might have a call, with in the same kind of time frame from someone with a marked accent or some other attribute that sort of identifies them as being from a minority population or demographic,
right?
And that could be a sign of testing as well. So sure. I think I think it was Terry Kate. I took her around the state years ago, back in 2003 or 4. And one of the things she really hammered home with folks is, your response is always, we consider all requests for reasonable accommodation or modification, for instance, and then you do that. You consider it, and you think about, as David mentioned, are there alternatives that can achieve the same goal as the requested accommodation, that don't require an alteration of your fundamental, business or scope.
Or it's like it minimizes that alteration or change.
Right, exactly. And I know, for instance, if you have a model unit, in a subdivision, and you're showing this model unit for something, a subdivision that's being built, that should have an accessible, option. I remember going to see the Indie Dwell. They're the folks that make housing out of shipping containers, and I went to their initial model to take a look at it, and it had steps and everything, and I knew that there were some folks that I worked with who might appreciate a unit like they were building, but they wouldn't be able to get in and move around in it. And I just mentioned that to one of the owners, and not in any kind of an aggressive way or anything. I just said, hey, this is something that just occurred to me. And I went back to take some other folks to show them that model. And lo and behold, they had a beautiful ramp that they'd constructed, to get access to this model. And it was really brilliant. So I referred a lot of people to them. So it's something that, it tells clients that you care about their needs, and you want to make sure they have access to the properties that you're marketing. And you might develop a name for yourself among that, that demographic. Because they talk about that, and share that information with friends. So those are some thoughts.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I mean, you guys have been very quiet. If you want to, unmute yourselves and ask a question, or if you want to type something into the chat, happy to entertain that. And I've thrown a few links in the chat here if you guys want to, save that chat file. Those are just some things that you might explore down the road, and hopefully give you a little bit of information you can either, use to learn more about, sort of disability and access and things like that, or share with colleagues, who might want to learn more about that. I don't know. I guess
clear as can be.
Yeah, I guess there are no questions. That means David did a great job. So I also did, David, I put a link to your video with the Real Estate Commission in that chat.
Okay.
So because I think that's a really great piece that has a lot of good information in it. So I guess we have a minute left, but barring any questions, we can certainly let people go a little early, and you can enjoy that extra 60 seconds of freedom.
Yeah, 60 seconds early. Anyway, well, glad to do it, Eric. Everybody, good luck out there, and till next time.
Yeah, good luck in the market. I hope you have a great spring.
Yeah, I'm not selling.
Yeah, neither am I. Yeah,
Nor am I buying.
I couldn't buy anything, so why would I sell? All right.
The input. All right.
Everybody take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.